Ever wonder if you're really making your own choices? From what to eat for lunch to who to spend your life with. Free will is something most of us assume we have. But what if the feeling of control is just that, a feeling? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
So even if I might know there's no actually real free will in the sense from a neuroscience perspective, I still am under the illusion because I'm seeing the world through my brain.
Because it has implications for public policy, it has implications for criminal law, it has implications for morality, it has implications for our interpersonal relationships.
We're confronting a situation where the technology is moving so fast that our moral intuitions and systems can't handle it.
We have to believe in free will because the alternative is so frightening.
In this episode, can we really shape our destiny? Joining me today, Dr. Heather Berlin, neuroscientist, psychologist, and professor of psychiatry. Dr. Gregg Caruso, philosopher and professor of ethics. Dr. Shadi Hamid, columnist at The Washington Post, research professor of Islamic studies, and co-host of the podcast Wisdom of Crowds. And last but not least, Dr. Peter C., professor of cognitive neuroscience. Thank you all for being here. I want to kick us off with a rapid-fire question. Just give me a yes, no, or it's complicated. Free will. Where do you stand? Heather.
It's complicated.
Gregg.
We don't have it.
Shadi.
Yes, free will exists, definitely.
And
I
Peter.
agree. Yes, definitely.
So people have been debating this topic for millennia, but we are going to solve it today. Gregg, let's start with you. You didn't actually make the choice to be here. It was completely outside of your control. Is that right?
No, not exactly. So as a free will skeptic, I think we make choices. They're just not free. There's differences between having an eye twitch and making a cup of coffee, choosing to make a cup of coffee. I don't think free will skeptics have to deny that there are choices. The question for me ultimately is, what are the determining factors that go into making that choice? Are those reasons, the deliberation, the contemplation, the weighing of different types of beliefs and desires, ultimately up to the agent? And my argument would be that those themselves are the byproducts of factors beyond the control of agents.
Peter, how did you end up here today? Your own free will?
Apart from being invited, yes, I weighed my options. I was invited. I thought, well, I could take part in this debate or I could not, and, weighed the pros and cons. I deliberated in my imagination, played things out, and then selected what I thought was the best option, and then carried out the motoric acts needed to make that envisioned future a reality.
Heather?
My unconscious made me do it.
Mm.
No, I think, we, as Peter said, we have this sense that it's us doing the deciding. But, we know from a neuroscientific perspective that our brain is kind of making the decisions, and our consciousness and awareness of the decisions we make kind of lags a bit behind. So it feels as if we're in control, but really it's our brain making those decisions outside of our awareness. So it doesn't give us that sort of free will in the sense that we really want it, in the sense that we can do something outside of what our brain is telling us to do.
Shadi, do you feel like you're in control?
Yeah, and I think the thing about free will is that we feel ourselves making choices, and we have to at some level trust our sensory perception. That there's so many instances in life where there's a fork in the road and there's paths available to us, and there is a lot of deliberation that goes into it. We decide, we weigh different factors, we consider counterfactuals, and that's why throughout human history, the majority of people have believed in some version of free will, especially if you look at people from religious traditions like Islam and Christianity, which both have robust conceptions of free will, because without free will, there is no morality. So in some sense, we have to believe in free will because the alternative is so frightening. And we're going to talk more about that.
Can I just say something to what he said? You said we have to trust our sensory perception, but I would disagree with that because our perception of the world is a construct of the brain, and it's not a one-to-one correspondence to reality. So also when it comes to free will, although I agree that it's important for us to function in society and to have a sense of morality, to have a sense of free will, but it doesn't mean that it actually is true.
But if we feel something is true, then in effect it becomes true to us. That if we feel it's real, it is
Well,
effectively
it's
real.
subjective, but it doesn't mean that it's objectively real.
But does that matter so much? As long as we
think
believe
so.
it's real, wouldn't that be the fundamental concern?
As a scientist, I'm very much want to understand objective reality, and the whole point of the scientific method is to remove subjectivity from that. Because I could think something is real, he could think something different is real. Actually, we all think different things are real, but is there an objective reality? And if so, that's what I'm really interested in trying to understand.
But can we take the subjective out of objective reality, right? So our subjective experience, our consciousness is a creation of our brain, and it's part of reality, right? I don't think we can deny that the subjective is part of reality. So, for example, if I see red, right, even though atoms are not red, redness is some kind of construction of my brain. If some scientist said, well, you don't actually see red, I would say, no, it's obvious to me. I feel red, see red, or feel pain. And subjectively, I play out possibilities in my imagination, and that's very real. The question is then, is it simply an illusion that I have, what I play out in my mind has some effect on reality, or is it actually consequential for what happens in reality?
If I could jump in, maybe as a philosopher, I make a number of distinctions that I think are kind of relevant. For one, I think you can't make the argument, I feel myself free, therefore I am free, right? I think that itself is sort of perhaps a fallacy. You need more than that, I think. And one of the things that I want to make sure we're not going to slide into is this idea that if you deny free will, you deny control, or just deny deliberation, or deny choice. I think it's important to define what we mean by free will.
Right.
I mean, that's a kind of important starting point. So
Okay.
I define free will as the control and action required for a very particular type of moral responsibility, the kind of moral responsibility that would make agents truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward. I think it's a good starting point because it's a neutral definition. It's controversial enough to debate, right? It captures the practical importance of the debate. So I want to make sure that the problem of free will doesn't become just a purely metaphysical problem or an abstract, scientific question about what's happening in the brain. I want to make sure we tie the issue of free will to real life practices, policies, treatments. For me, things like criminal law, criminal justice weigh heavily on whether or not we have this kind of free will.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of empirical evidence from what's called experimental philosophy that ordinary folks see free will as connected to moral responsibility. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that it's the desire to blame and punish that drive assessments about free will. So unlike what a lot of philosophers think, we make this calm deliberation about what kind of control actions have, and then we assess calmly that they had this level of control, therefore they're morally culpable. What actually the evidence seems to suggest is that when an agent does, say, a wrongful act, we have a very strong desire to blame, to punish. That is going to drive the assessment of what kind of free will the agent has, how much control we think is required for that agent to have free will. And evidence actually shows people will change the level of control they think is required to justify those blame assessments, dependent on how much they want to hold the individual accountable.
Wow.
There's also a lot of evidence that increased belief in free will increases punitive responses. It leads to increased assessments of punishment, hypothetical scenarios about what we think people deserve in criminal context. So it's a little bit like the carts before the horse. And I do think maybe theologically there's a desire to want to preserve those kinds of assessments of blame and accountability for theological reasons. But I think one question we have to ask is focusing on the actual practices, like is like resentment, indignation, moral anger, retributive punishment morally justified or not?
Those are all good things to have in a society that we want to hold people accountable for crimes. And if they don't have free will according to the definition that you used, then we can't really convict people for crimes. We can't put them in prison. We can't have a structure of accountability. And for any society to run, we need to have those things. So that I think is the
Well,
danger.
that's where I would disagree.
But I think we should pose, I mean, for viewers and listeners, do they really want to live in a world where people don't get put into prison
That's not
if
the
they commit
implication,
crimes?
though. So what I would argue is that there's a whole alternative set of justifications that we could employ to deal with these kind of issues. Both morality, I disagree with your assessment. Morality would end. So I'm an optimistic free will skeptic. I think that not only do we lack this kind of free will and this kind of basic desert moral responsibility, but the implications would actually be beneficial, and that we could still justify
Basic
things.
dessert. I'm going to pause you there
Yeah.
because I'm following you, but then I want to make sure our audience is too. Basic dessert. What do you mean
It's
by
the
that?
dessert that would allow for the kind of harm of blame and punishment for an agent simply because they did wrong. They deserve it, right? They justly deserve either resentment, indignation, moral anger, retributive punishment, without any reference to, say, forward-looking benefits. So like someone does something wrong, we want to punish them. There's kind of two reasons you can give generally for why we might want to punish someone: to deter future crime, to make society safer, to help in the moral formation of the agent. Those are forward-looking reasons. You don't need free will for those. Backward-looking reasons is they simply deserve it.
Can I jump in here? So I think I take a kind of sort of the middle ground, and I guess philosophers would say I'm a compatibilist. But I think defining free will is very important. So in terms of my definition, it's this Cartesian idea of free will is the idea that if every neuron in your brain was firing exactly the same way, and everything in the environment was exactly the same, you could have done otherwise, which implies there's some sort of ghost in the machine. And this is getting into metaphysical arguments, but I'm going to bring it back to this idea of morality. So in that sense, I don't believe in free will, right? I don't think there's a ghost in the machine that can do something other than what your brain and, is telling you. And theoretically, if I knew everything about your history, your, genetics, everything in the environment and every neuron firing in your brain, I could predict what you're going to do. Although there's so many variables, it's almost impossible to do that, but theoretically you could. And I don't think that there's some ghost that can do otherwise. That being said, I think that as humans, we have the capacity to have self-control. We've evolved this prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like a brake system, which is where our concepts of morality sort of, exist. And we hold people responsible to the extent that they have the capacity to have self-control. And so therefore, in terms of judicial consequences, a child whose prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until about the age of 25, we hold them less responsible for their actions because they don't have the capacity for self-control. We hold someone less responsible if they have brain damage to the prefrontal cortex, if they have certain psychiatric illnesses, because they have less capacity for self-control. So I think there's this idea that if you have a fully formed prefrontal cortex, you have more degrees of freedom, more capacity to make different choices, more capacity to control your impulses and your basic desires, and have a sort of higher moral concept. And there's a whole, psychology of the stages of moral development and how we develop our morality. But so I think people, even though we don't have free will in that classic kind of philosophical, metaphysical sense, we still have people can be held responsible for their actions. It's not like I can say, oh, my neurons made me do it, and therefore I have no responsibility.
And
so
they can
it's
be
sort
held
of
responsible because they have self-control.
because they have the capacity to have self-control.
Now,
Heather,
No,
Greg, just pause for one moment, because both of you guys gave us your definition. So I want to make sure then we're getting a definition on this
Good.
side of the
You're
table.
right. So what is our
Peter, what is
definition?
your definition?
Well, I would say my definition of free will would be that an agent, such as a person or an animal, has the capacity to affect or alter the probabilities of future events happening for its own reasons, and that a person or an animal can play out possibilities in its mind, and that those possibilities are the imagined possibilities correspond to real possibilities, and that therefore an agent has some say in making the future it wants to happen. So I would disagree actually with the linkage of morality necessarily to the question of free will, because a tiger, for example, has the capacity to deliberate, but it might not be moral or immoral, but rather amoral. So, for example, a tiger might look at a zebra and think, well, if I go this way, it's faster but louder. But if I go that way, it's whatever, and it could say, woo, and it can deliberate. But I wouldn't say that a tiger is moral or immoral. I'd say a tiger is amoral, primarily because a tiger doesn't have any say in how it itself will become. Whereas we, unlike a tiger, are not driven solely by instincts. We can choose to become a new kind of chooser, effectively. We have not just the sort of first order free will of a tiger, which is an amoral form of free will, but the second order form of free will where we can choose to become a different kind of person in the future. Like I can choose to, say, learn Arabic. I don't speak Arabic now, but I can, get a book and change my nervous system such that in a year from now I can communicate. In 3 years I can be fluent.
Wow.
Let me just add to that I don't think the argument that my brain may do it is really an argument against free will. I mean, our consciousness, I would say, is not simply the downstream passive epiphenomenal consequence of neural activity. I would argue that our consciousness plays a central role in our volitional actions.
So are you a dualist?
No, of course, I'm a monist.
What is a dualist?
Oh, sorry. Meaning that there's physical matter, and then there's this non-physical matter, consciousness. This is what Descartes was sort of thinking, and that the consciousness or the mind can act on the matter. Like I'm not a dualist. So I think the neurons create consciousness. And it's almost sort of epiphenomenal. You keep saying, I can decide to do this, I can decide. But who is the I? And, most of what's happening in our brain is happening unconsciously. We're only conscious of this very little bit. So it feels like we have so much control. But really, I think it's like maybe our brain has free will, our unconscious has free will and is deciding. And you're conscious of it after the fact.
So Heather, it sounds like you're saying you're separating your conscious from yourself.
I would say the self is a construct of the brain. It's another conscious perception. I think you are your brain. You are this physical being. Like, and if you're doing harm, let's say you're, murdering people, obviously you need to be locked away because your physical being is doing harm to others. But that's a separate question than this perception of self that we create within our minds. So, you're saying the I, but what if there is no I? That's just another construct of consciousness. And most of what's happening is happening behind the scenes.
Right. So monism refers to the idea that there's just one kind of fundamental substance, and you can be a physical monist, like there's just energy in space-time, or you could say there's only spiritual substance of some sort, or only ideas. I mean, people have taken all those positions, and a dualist would say that there's two fundamental types or more, mind and matter.
How do you categorize yourself?
Oh, I'm a monist, and I believe that, there's only nature. There's no supernatural events, and that, we could think of it as processing in space-time. But to say that that is the case doesn't rule out that there are other things realized in energy that are not themselves having the properties of energy. So let me give you an example. What is it to have the properties of energy? You have mass, you have momentum, you have inertia, and so forth. But there are things like ideas or information that are realized in matter that themselves don't have mass or inertia or momentum. So, for example, I could look at a bunch of ink on a piece of paper, say, BAD. Now, if my decoding scheme is English, that means not good. But if my decoding scheme of that same identical physical input is German, that means bath. So where does that information exist, right? It doesn't exist in the ink itself. It exists in how my brain decodes that information. So acts of decoding information, although they are realized in physical processing, they have non-physical properties in the sense that, redness or pain or the word or the understanding of the meaning bath or bad doesn't have inertia, momentum, or mass itself.
So would you say it's an emergent property?
Sure, you can call it an emergent
just
property.
like wetness isn't an H2O, but when you bring a bunch of H2O molecules together, it has the quality of wetness, and consciousness is an emergent phenomena of the matter that's functioning.
But there could be multiple senses of emergence, and the question is how radical emergent properties do you want to posit, right?
Sure.
If you think that there are emergent substances that could emerge out of physical properties, and then get yourself some sort of agent causal libertarian view out of that kind of emergence. That's a different kind of metaphysics than a sort of normal case of emergence where you get this higher order property.
Sure, like
Right.
water, for example, right?
Like water.
Oxygen is a gas, hydrogen is a gas,
Yeah.
but you combine them and it is a liquid.
Yeah.
That's a different
Yeah.
kind of set of properties.
So I would say that these metaphysical distinctions aren't going to, in my view, settle the problem of free will. So if I go back to Heather, I would say one thing. If you deny free will, you don't have to say we're meat puppets. You also, if you deny free will, I think there's a lot of agreement between all of us in terms of the fact that we make deliberations. We deliberated to come here today. We made a choice. The question is what kind of factors go into determining those choices. I think that's one of the key points to focus on. But I also want to push back on the idea that there would be no moral responsibility. So I don't want to overly complicate the conversation, but I think you could distinguish between multiple senses of responsibility. So I am causally responsible for my actions. Just like a tree is causally responsible for causing damage to a roof. Don't need free will for that. I could be liability responsible. That is, like if I get in a car accident, I'm liable for the damages done. Different than criminal culpability. Don't need free will for that. I could have attributability responsibility, which is you could attribute to me various characteristics, personality traits, qualities. Don't need free will for that. And I would also argue you can have a very rich sense of forward-looking moral responsibility that's not grounded in basic desert, but grounded in practices like moral formation, safety, reconciliation, and maybe restitution and recovery of victims. With those forward-looking practices being the grounds for which you engage in some kind of moral exchange. And so I've always argued in my work that you could have a rich set of practices, interpersonal practices, moral practices, all without free will. The only kind of properties I'm denying is what I would say is agents have the kind of control and action required for, say, retributive punishment, moral anger, resentment, indignation, that desert sense, that individuals deserve some kind of harsh or harm, in the form of blame or punishment, or even reward in the, form of praise, in a basic sense. And
So we shouldn't blame Hitler for causing the
we could
deaths
hold
of
Hitler
60 million
accountable,
people?
and we could also engage, and I could justify incapacitation. So this goes back to Shadi's point, right?
Exactly.
So-
I want to pause you there because you brought up morality, and
Yeah.
I recognize we haven't yet gotten Shadi's definition of free will.
I like Peter's.
How does that play out in your own life?
How does
Peter's definition of free will play out in your own life? Give me an example.
So I think
What does
that
that
the
mean?
ability to reason is really crucial. I mean, Peter drew the distinction between tigers and human beings. So the ability to make moral judgments that are at a kind of higher conceptual level, that aren't just about actions and causal chains of activity, that we actually are moral agents. And morality is something that makes sense for humans in a way it doesn't for other beings. And once you have a concept of morality, then you also have a concept of accountability. And once you have a concept of morality, you also are able to explain evil. And this brings us, I think, to how free will is really important for understanding Hitler, Putin, Saddam Hussein. And some people might say, well, how could God allow for these terrible things to happen? But if God stopped Hitler, he would be intervening against Hitler's free will. Or if God had foreknowledge that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, well, wouldn't that be great if he could stop Putin from doing that? But Putin has free will and agency and moral responsibility. So you wouldn't want to have a God who is perpetually interfering in every small act that someone is doing. So let's say I'm doing something relatively minor that hurts a friend of mine or causes pain to someone that I love. Does it really make sense for God to intervene in those kinds of acts? So for the universe to be morally consistent, for there to be a coherent structure of accountability, we need God. God knows what's going to happen ahead of time because God is omniscient. He has foreknowledge. But that doesn't mean he's making us do one thing or another. And we see this in scripture time and time again. It's really one of the consistent themes about choice, that people can choose to believe, they can choose to disbelieve, they can choose to act well, they can choose to hurt people. And this is actually the one thing that ties the Abrahamic faiths and really most faiths together, this sense of moral agency, that we are actors. And that's also a very empowering thing. And that's why I think that, let's say hypothetically, that free will wasn't real. Let's say that Gregg is right, that the objective reality is
Your
that
hypothetical, Shadi, is Gregg's reality. So
Yeah,
let's
exactly.
go down this hypothetical.
So I'm
Okay.
granting that. Let's say that Gregg is right about how some of these things operate from a metaphysical sense. I think it would be better for all of us to ignore Gregg and believe that free will exists regardless, because we can live better lives if we believe that we're free. And
I would challenge that.
but there's actually, and you're probably, there are actually some really interesting psychological studies on this, that when you prime people and you get them to read a passage that free will is an illusion, they're actually more likely to cheat and to act aggressively.
I'm going to say no to that. That failed to replicate. That study has many, many flaws.
Give me the layperson translation to what that means, that failed to replicate. So that
So
study.
there was a famous Vosenschooler study that everyone cites, everyone talks about. It was caught up in what's called the replication crisis, which is when they try to repeat the same findings by other labs, they don't get the results. I've written a lot about that study because it's one of the ones that everyone always cites. There's multiple problems with that study. First of all, the prime they used to get people to disbelieve in free will was actually not priming disbelief in free will. It was priming the idea that their mental states had no causal efficacy, a kind of epiphenomenalism. Free will skeptics don't have to embrace a reductionist view of the mind. They don't have to embrace epiphenomenalism. Second, various labs have tried to replicate it, can't reproduce it. The third is there's a whole discussion about whether these primes are actually useful in these epistemic kind of scenarios where you have someone just read a passage. Leading scientists tell us there's no free will. First of all, those they're called primes because they're little passages you read to prime these beliefs. They actually are not very effective. You often get very small sample sizes in terms of results. And there's a lot of pushback as to whether they're useful at all. And then the biggest problem with the thing is it would only tell us at best that there's a short-term effect, because it goes away right away, a short-term effect of negative behavior based on maybe a perhaps misunderstanding of what free will skepticism entails. And maybe you shouldn't do your taxes immediately being told after you lack free will. But doesn't say anything about a long-term sophisticated understanding of what free will entails and what it doesn't. And what it doesn't entail is many of the things that were just suggested. So I think you could preserve meaning, you could preserve moral responsibility, you could preserve incapacitating serious criminals, seriously dangerous criminals. And I actually would argue that belief in free will has more negative consequences than positive. We could talk about that later.
So I want to break down what you're saying just to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So Shadi is saying there's at least one study that shows that people, when they don't believe in free will, are more inclined to do quote unquote bad things, engage in criminality, perhaps. You're saying you disagree with that and you don't think, if true, that they're long-lasting effects.
Yeah, I mean, the effect actually isn't real. There is no effect. So that study itself isn't any good. And there's a number of studies that actually have now been done on the other side of the fence that suggest that long-term belief in free will correlates with a number of really potentially harmful beliefs that are more systematic and aren't induced with primes. So the thing with the just reading a passage, first of all, what the passage says is not what free will skepticism says. So that was the biggest problem. They use a passage by Francis Crick that basically said that mental states, don't play any role in individuals' actions. Not what free will skepticism.
But you're being a little bit selective here. You're saying that only if they're primed according to Gregg's definition of free will
the
skepticism.
whole notion of primes themselves are questionable. So like there's an issue about the passages.
Yeah.
But it's not just my definition. Everyone who is somewhat sophisticated and knows anything about free will knows that passage is not priming disbelief.
Can I jump
Isn't
in
there
here?
also a confirmation bias issue that you're more likely to look at studies that are skeptical of free will and not like them because you are invested in believing that free will is an illusion?
No, I look at all the studies, and I've written about
So
all the
you're
studies.
purely objective.
I'm looking at the studies to see what they show and what they don't show. I should say the studies themselves are still independent of the issue whether we actually have free will or not, right? But the studies are saying what would the effects of disbelief in free will be? And those few selective studies actually have not replicated. They only replicate in an extremely limited context where they use a bludgeon of a definition. And even with that definition, they haven't been able to produce the effect.
Heather, you've been trying to make a point.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on something that Shadi had said, because it seemed like you were kind of working backwards. So the idea, which I get, is that, God gave us free will. Like you have to be able to have free will so that you can choose good versus bad and which allows for evil in the world, right? But then you're almost saying that because of this religious belief, it necessitates free will. Like there has to be free will in order for the whole system to work but that's sort of working backwards to say we need free will to explain this other phenomenon. I agree with you that the illusion of free will, it's an important one that we have, just like our illusion of our sense of self is an important one to have as we're people interacting in society. So we talk about these individual studies that we do in a lab, which might not be what we say ecologically valid, or, like they might not be applicable to how we function in the real world. But when you look at how we function in society, we need a sense of self to help us interact with other people. We've evolved the sense of self for a reason. We've evolved the sense of free will for a reason, because if we think we have the capacity to act of our own volition and then make moral decisions, it helps us function in society. So I think these are all really important constructs to have. And it's just like any other illusion, like a visual illusion. There are these illusions where there's two, squares and they look like they're different shades of gray, but we know they're exactly the same shade. But even though I know that, I still can't get around the illusion. They still look different to me. So even if I might know there's no actually like real free will in the sense from a neuroscience perspective, I still am under the illusion because I'm seeing the world through my brain. I can't sort of escape it. And I think it's an important illusion to have, to give us that sense that we have agency and that we have this sense of morality.
Yeah, totally agree. That's a very strong case for free will right there. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter what the science tells us ultimately. If the illusion is good, and most people don't care about science or specific explanations of metaphysics. So for all intents and purposes, we should all act as if free will is real and true, regardless of anything else.
Well, we can say the illusion is real, that is real, but let's just say from a scientific perspective, there are certain experiments you can do where you can, using imaging, where you can predict up to 10 seconds in advance by just looking at brain activation, whether a person is going to decide to go left or right? So we can see these precursors to our actions and our decisions, or before you even have the sense of, I had the feeling to make a decision, we can see a buildup of brain activation that we can predict which way you're going to go. So in a real practical sense, we don't have that free will as we would like to describe it as such, like there's this sort of conscious person that's intervening. But I would grant you that, yes, the illusion is real.
Okay, so although I agree with you that there's free will, on this one point I'll agree with Heather
Yeah.
that we don't want to say, well, we need a moral universe, we need moral blameworthiness, and therefore free will must be the case, or we need to believe in the illusion of free will. Much better would be to prove that there's free will in fact, and as a consequence of that, morality would emerge. Now, concerning this one study you just mentioned about being able to predict, well, it may be true that, in an MRI study, I'm able to predict whether people will choose left versus right with, say, 60% accuracy when chance is 50% 10 seconds before. But I can predict, that 10 years from now, in the year, whatever it's going to be, 2035, that on this day or date at 3:14 a.m., you will, with a 90% probability, be asleep. And that's probably almost surely true. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have no volition at all, right? You're able to deliberate, consider what you want to pay attention to in light of your own reasons.
Greg, can we have purpose in life if we don't have free will?
Yes. So I think that even if we lack free will, we can preserve most of what we want in terms of our interpersonal relationships, meaning in life, morality, creativity, and even what is necessary to maintain social order. So in my work, again, I've kind of systematically gone through these different domains to try to say, there are these alternatives to some of our current practices that would do all the same work that our existing practices do, perhaps without the negative aspects, like the corrosive nature of moral anger, for example, often gets in the way of our interpersonal relationships and actually is probably more harmful for the goals we're looking to achieve, like moral formation in my daughter, right? Trying to make her a better person.
So I need you to walk me through that
Yes.
because I have 2-year-old twins and I'm often trying to change and shape them morally.
Yeah.
What's the best way to go about that? What do you mean by moral formation?
So here's a kind of forward-looking set of practices we could adopt even if we lack free will. Someone does something, could be my daughter. I ask her, why did you, what were the reasons for why you acted in that way? She could then identify those reasons for her action. You could ask her to reflect upon those reasons, say, what do those reasons reveal about you as a person? Do you think that there are any measures you can take moving forward that would alter those kinds of characteristics that you find undesirable? And the moral exchange, and I've cashed this out sort of in a number of my works, the moral exchange would be grounded in a set of practices where it's not based on desert, it's based on moral formation. So as a parent, I have a vested interest in the moral development of my child.
Right.
As a member of society, I also have a vested interest in maintaining safety. So when wrongdoers engage in wrongdoing, you want to be able to engage in acts of what I call moral protest, which are still, I think, justifiable. It's just not associated with the kind of angry blame, if you want to use a term, that is often associated with the belief in free will. And I actually think freeing it from angry blame is an actually better way to achieve these forward-looking goals. Reconciliation is also a big one. So often we want to reconcile with the person who's wronged us, especially in an intimate personal relationship, parent-child, friend, parent. Moral anger, resentment, indignation, which philosophers often associate with the kinds of attitudes that are justified if we have free will, are actually usually corrosive, have a negative effect. They're suboptimal in terms of achieving that reconciliation and that types of moral formation.
Well, we don't always want reconciliation. Sometimes we should be angry because our anger is called for a dictator or someone who murders or rapes. We should be angry. We should be outraged. There should be blame. That I don't see why we should assume that those things are bad or corrosive. So I'm not sure what the starting premise is, but yes, I mean,
the starting premise would be, are those justified?
Yes,
and the question is, do we have the kind of free will that would
evil,
justify them?
If someone commits evil, anger is 100% justified.
You
Why
can
wouldn't it
engage
be?
in a different practice called moral protest. And moral protest I could say what Hitler did is wrong. In axiological judgments, which are just judgments of good and bad, still exists without free will. So if a serial killer commits, a set of murders, and let's say even by compatibilist standards, libertarian standards, we determined that they weren't free because they had some kind of brain degenerative disorder or failed to have the capacity that even compatibilists would acknowledge is sufficient for free will. Right. So let's say that they don't meet those standards, current standards, we would still say what they did is wrong. Axiological judgments of right or wrong still exist. Right. We could also say, in a forward-looking sense, why did they do it? Right. And if they pose a forward-looking risk to society, I think we could justify incapacitating them. So here's my analogy. It's with quarantine. And let's say I flew here to have this debate in person and I contract Ebola. And I get out at the airport, you test me, I test positive for Ebola. I think everyone at the table would say the state is justified in restricting my liberty by quarantining me. And the justification on my theory is grounded in a right of self-defense or prevention of harm to others, right? But it's not punishment. under any intuitive definition of punishment. Because punishment usually has a intentional imposition of harm. It also has a condemnatory component. We're not condemning the Ebola patient. By analogy, I would argue, we could justify incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals on the right of self-defense or prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification for quarantine, without presupposing free will or basic desert or just deserts. But if we justify these kinds of practices on those grounds, a number of really important things follow. And one in particular, which I care a lot about because I've written a lot about criminal justice reform, is that you have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer contagious, right, within the Ebola analogy. In the criminal justice context, I think the state has a moral duty to rehabilitate and reintegrate individuals. You also—
I wonder, Greg, though, who gave them that moral duty? Where does that come from?
So moral duties can still be justified on whatever your favorite moral theory is. And we could go down different ways philosophers have justified normative claims. Utilitarian, I'm a virtue ethicist, so I like the theory of virtue ethics. But you could be a Kantian, you could be a utilitarian, whatever those preferred, I'm not going to go down that road, right? But whatever your preferred theory
Right.
of where we get normative claims from still can be reconciled with that agent lacking the kind of desert that would justify harmful treatment.
Can I break in here? So just to kind of pull back a little bit, I think there's a disagreement. So I think both don't believe in free will for different reasons, but I do believe in that people can be held accountable for their actions. There can be praise. There can be, people are personally responsible, and it's not black or white. So for you, it's black or white. Like there is no right. There's no free will, and also therefore that means then there is no person, like you're not accountable for your actions.
Well, can I give you a kind of argument?
Okay, but wait, before that,
Yeah.
what I want to say is there's a gradation there. So even though there's no free will, like I said, in this sort of classic Cartesian sense, you can do something outside of what your brain is, you're kind of a prisoner to your brain. And in that sense, I have some sort of empathy for people and in the way that they behave and they act. But still, I think there's degrees of personal responsibility. So you are someone like a Hitler, I think, is responsible for his actions as long as he has a fully formed brain and no brain damage and whatnot. We start seeing that, okay, look, he had a huge tumor in his prefrontal cortex. I mean, we've seen a case like there's a sort of modern day case where a man was arrested for pedophilia type behavior. He was taken away from his home. He started getting headaches. They did MRI. There was a huge tumor in his prefrontal cortex. They removed the tumor. He was going to go to prison. They removed the tumor. His symptoms went away. He was allowed to return home. About a year later, the symptoms came back and the tumor had grown back, right? So there's a direct correlation there between his sort of immoral behavior and some dysfunction in the brain. So I think that we hold those people less accountable for their actions, but in a fully formed brain, in somebody who, maybe they have a genetic predisposition and things that we can't quite measure yet, but we hold them accountable and there is responsibility. And I think there's also important for people to have praise for the good things that they do. So it's, even though there's not free will, there is this capacity to do good to do harm, and that we can either punish or praise people for that.
But I feel like we're going down the rabbit hole of moral accountability or morality when there's no necessary link, I think. I mean, it might be necessary that in order to have moral accountability, you need the ability to have done otherwise. So that's one argument. But I would argue that free will, as I define it, the ability to have some say in the matter of what future will become real for you, is true of animals too. And animals, I wouldn't say are moral or immoral, but amoral. And I'll just give, this returns now to the argument you made that belief in free will plays no role in what people actually do. I would say if you look at other data from animals, it's pretty clear that what animals believe and think is going to happen has a huge effect on what they do. So for example, there's a set of studies done by Marty Seligman called the Learned Helplessness Studies. So what they do is they take a dog, say, and they put it in a closed cage and it gets shocked. And the animal just can't do anything about it, and it kind of gives up. And then after, an hour of hurting the animal, they open the door. The animal doesn't even try to escape anymore. So it believes that it has no way to get out. You open the door, it could get out, but it's given up hope, so to speak. Another study was done by C.P. Richter in the 1950s at Johns Hopkins, in which the study, it was really quite sick, looked at how long it took for rats to drown. So they put a rat into a cylinder with, let's say a meter of water, and the rat had to swim. And they put a little clip on the ear, and they measured when the heart stopped. And they had very nice data, say, 500 rats, that, most rats gave up at about 4 minutes and drowned. And that was the objective measure, was that the heart stopped. Now, one time, the technician forgot to put the little clip on the ear to measure the heart rate, and quickly came in and put it back on. And that rat swam for 76 hours.
Wow.
It became a different kind of rat, right? Simply because presumably it had been rescued and believed that it would be rescued again. It had hope, and it's horrible, but it then drowned after 76 hours. So belief and hope are very central to agency, a feeling of agency. And I think, animals can have a feeling of agency completely separate from the question of the morality or immorality of their actions. And then I'll give you one final real world example, right? So in the 1940s, there was this shipping magnate in England whose ships were getting torpedoed by the German U-boats, the submarines. And the statistical people came and said, it's really strange, but it's the young men who are drowning and dying, not the old guys who are 50, 60 years old. Why is that? And so this was very puzzling. And for the shipping magnate, it was very expensive because he had to pay all kinds of pensions to the widows. And so he hired an educator called, I think, Kurt Hahn, to interview everybody. And what this educator found was, namely, that the young guys gave up. They started blubbering for their mother. They started fighting over a plank rather than taking turns, whereas the old guys had been through a lot of stuff, and they had the confidence, the belief that they can get through this too. Now, maybe some of them didn't make it, but the ones that did believed firmly in their own capacity, their own feeling of agency, that feeling of agency that animals have, the knowledge that you can get through this willpower capacity, has very little to do, I think, necessarily with morality. But it's fundamental to what I mean by free will, and animals have that too.
Peter, you mentioned belief and hope. So Shadi, I want to go to you with that. Thinking of the concept of belief and sin, because you argue that moral goodness is something that we all have, whether you actually believe in God or not, you have it. So I think it's fair to say that many people believe having faith itself is a choice. Is it? Do you believe that? Or is it predetermined by your upbringing, your environment?
Look, there are always going to be factors that make it more or less likely that we'll do certain things later in life. We're all products of our context. And we also know that if you're born and raised in a certain religion, you're very likely to stay in that religion and not convert to something completely different. But you're still choosing whether or not to believe. I mean, there are, tens of millions of Americans who grew up in Christian households, but then became so-called nuns, those without a formal religious affiliation, or agnostic or atheist. People maybe don't convert to other religions, but they sometimes gain more faith. Sometimes they lose their faith and leave the church. These things are very common. As for whether there's a choice in the matter, I'm very much of the belief that this is what I tell people who are unsure that God exists, that find a church, find a mosque, act as if you believe. Do the ritual, do the practice, be part of community, and then you might find that your heart is open to something new. So in that sense, there is this sense of possibility, and you can decide intellectually God exists. You can sort of I can almost, and I would even ask people who are watching this, just try that yourself. Just decide. And then you might actually be surprised of what might happen as a result. We can make decisions. We can will things into being. And I think that's a better way to live, this idea that we really have agency, that we're not just prisoners to the past. That's a very dangerous way. I think that contributes to our sense of victimhood. And victimhood is a very big problem in America. People on both sides of the aisle, they're always treating themselves as victims, and they're always seeing that the other side is making them into victims. So let's not act that way, and let's actually act as if we have profound choices.
But even
Heather,
though,
Shadi said we can will things into being, and I was feeling this side of the table, my opposite side, have thoughts formulate. So Heather first, then Gregg.
Okay, so I was just going to say a couple of things. Like, even though I'm saying there's no free will in the philosophical sense of the term, when we're talking about practically speaking, you're talking about shifts in perspective. Like, there's this shift, when astronauts go to space, this overview effect. When you see the Earth for the first time from space, it fundamentally shifts how your whole belief system or how you think about things. If you have a belief in God or, any kind of, it can shift how you perceive the world. So you shift in your perception. I still think it's the brain that's doing these things. And even the belief studies that you talked about, right? When we have hope, and I believe in all, resilience and beliefs can help people have better outcomes for cancer, let's say, faith and those kinds of things. So I think they're all very useful and have impacts on how we perceive the world. I still think that's a separate issue than if it actually exists. So I have two hats on. One is, as a scientist, I want to see the data, right? I want there to be some evidence and I want to be objective. I was talking about in the beginning, objectivity versus subjectivity. Subjectively, do I sometimes like say, talk to my dead grandma and hope she can intervene and things, Yeah, I have that sort of belief. But as a scientist, there's no evidence for that. So
But
I think
you do it anyway.
Yeah, I do it anyway because I'm still under the same illusion as everyone else. So as a scientist, what you're trying to do is break away from your own biases, your cognitive biases and your illusions, and see the world objectively. And that's what we look at data and the scientific method. So that's in one hat, I would say, from a scientific perspective, a data perspective, there's no such thing as free will, in this kind of philosophical sense. But as a human, I might feel otherwise. And I'm trying to separate out how it feels. It feels good to feel like I'm an agent. I feel like I have free will and I can will myself to go to the gym or whatever. But also I can know separately, cognitively, that objectively that might not be real.
Gregg?
It's weird because in a way, I think Peter and Shadi, I actually agree with them on age. So
Well, we love hearing that, but it is weird. Okay,
yes.
tell me
and maybe
why.
I disagree a little bit with Heather. I think it's very careful. I mean, it does sound a little semantic, but I do think the notion, and the word came up a few times, of agency, right? I acknowledge there's agency.
Okay.
I acknowledge there's differences between voluntary choices and involuntary choices. Sneezing or having an eye twitch is involuntary, whereas choosing to make a cup of coffee, the proximate cause, the immediate prior cause, is a set of inner desires, beliefs. I have a desire for coffee, a belief it's going to help me wake up. It's part of my ritual of, habituated action. So I think it's also, and I agree even with Peter's citation of those studies, it is very important to stress the agency of individuals. Like, I've looked at the role it plays in therapy, for example. It's very important to make people feel in therapy that they have some agency over the ability to change their course of action. Here would be the question I have, though. So let's simplify it. Let's not make it a complicated disorder. I have an addiction to chocolate. Okay. So I believe there's chocolate in the kitchen. I desire chocolate. So I go in and I eat the chocolate. But over time, I, put on some pounds. Maybe my wife makes some comments. Maybe my doctor tells me about my cholesterol. Maybe someone yells something out a window as they drive by. And now the desire to stop desiring chocolate is becoming stronger. And I take active steps. I go and I join Chocoholics Anonymous. And I attend some Chocoholics meetings. And now I get control of my craving to eat chocolate. Sounds like free will. But what I would question is, where did that desire to stop desiring chocolate come from? And that desire, the one that shifted the scales, that led you to deliberate in a different manner, led to a different outcome, itself had causal antecedents. Right? It's the cause of my wife's comments, the doctor, maybe information I read in a magazine, accumulation of all these different factors caused me to have these. But I don't ultimately control the shift in those scales.
And there's been
I
studies,
react to those shifts.
There's been studies
scales.
that show that so when Libet came up with his famous studies in the 1980s, where they showed there was like a precursor of brain activation about 350 milliseconds before a person was consciously aware of the decision they were going to make. This caused a big stir. And he said, okay, maybe there's free won't, meaning I can inhibit the I have this proponent response, and listen, we are limited by our genetic predispositions, right? There are certain constraints in terms of our degrees of freedom. You might have a gene that towards alcoholism, right? And that predicts your desire for that, or chocolate. But then the decision to inhibit, they thought, okay, what about free will? That's where free will comes in. And you have the desire, but then you can stop it. But then there was, Patrick Haggard did these neuroscience studies, which showed that even the decision to inhibit a response has these precursors, these neural precursors.
So then, Heather, do you believe in free don't?
No, I think that's also a product of our brain as well. But they're like, if an addict, a drug addict, let's say, is an addict, do you blame, oh, it's your fault, you're an addict? Or is it, okay, he has some genetic predisposition, or he had some trauma in his childhood, when it comes to those kinds of things, then we're less likely to say, oh, he's making the choice, right? That it's actually has a brain predisposition towards that, or genetic predisposition. But even the desire to change it is also a consequence of all the information that has been fed into your brain, that then it starts to weigh things differently and pushes you in a different direction.
If I could just go back to a point Heather made before, though, because I just want the example with the brain tumor and the person who had pedophilic tendencies. I want to make sure, as a free will skeptic, I don't engage in what I call excuse extensionalism, where we just start to extend the realm of excuses, because there are currently in our folk psychological practices and the law things that we will resolve responsibility of agents for, insanity defenses, brain tumors, right? And so those are already built into our existing practices. Some people think free will skepticism is just extending those to the point where then no one's free. But that would be an absurd kind of view, because if you extend that, then no one is reasons responsive, no one is, has the kind of rational control over their choices. I don't say that. What I'm denying is the whole desert-based system. And the whole desert-based system, I would say, itself is predicated on an unjustified philosophical assumption.
The idea that someone deserves something.
And that they have the control and action that would be required for that. And so I don't want to get into the realm of making further excuses based on neuroscientific discoveries. What I want to say is that the actual justification for the normal practices, even in cases, and I agree with Peter, there's, people have these rational abilities, people deliberate, people act on an array of choices that they have, contemplated and weighed the various options for. What I would argue, though, is even in those types of cases, the weight of the reasons they assign to those, what shirt to wear, what tie to wear, the thoughts that come to me, the moral evaluations that I'm aware of in that given moment, my own character, my own predispositions, my own what people call constitutive nature, who I am as an individual, those themselves are all byproducts of factors beyond my control.
But the problem is these ideas have major policy implications in society. And when you say that addicts and drug users don't deserve it, or don't deserve to be blamed, or don't deserve our anger, there has been an approach to progressive policing in major American cities that's been quite a failure, whether in San Francisco, Philadelphia, in my town city of DC, where you say we're not going to criminalize drug activity, and we're going to allow people to gather in public spaces and take drugs openly in front of the authorities. And we're going to try to rehabilitate them by giving them, if they want to have addict support, they can go to the local community center and try to do that. But what has resulted from that is chaos and lawlessness in our cities. And I think most people can agree that the progressive experiment has failed, which is why you've had recalls in places like San Francisco. It hasn't worked. So that's what I would put to you, is that these ideas are not abstract. They make our communities less safe, worse, and less just.
Yeah.
Chaos
Can
and
I
lawlessness.
return?
I picked up on that I know that some people would push back against, but I want to hear your take on this debate that you're hearing right here between Shadi and Gregg. Peter.
Well, again, I would say that the morality question is a separate question. We can still talk about the question of agency and the role of desires and so forth on our actions, and our ability to have some say in the matter of what becomes of us, and can we affect the future, without getting into the issue of just desert or blameworthiness.
So then,
so for example,
does that mean, though, let me ask you, does that mean there are concepts of sin and virtue? Do those two things mean something to you?
absolutely, I care a lot about morality and want to have a just society and so forth. But I thought this was a debate about primarily whether we have free will. And so I'm trying to separate the two.
And so you see those two things as separate.
Absolutely. I think animals can deliberate and consider their future possibilities and affect what possibilities are more likely to happen. And that has nothing to do with morality.
So,
But please, let me, so for example, I really, focusing on agency rather than morality, I can ask, well, am I an agent? Or in what sense am I an agent? I mean, take a first order desire, like hunger. Well, hunger simply emerges into my consciousness. I didn't choose for hunger to arise. Does that mean I have no free will? Well, I didn't choose. Hunger kind of just happened. However, given that hunger has happened, I can now look for restaurants that, are to my taste. And maybe I didn't choose my tastes, like I like Indian. I just happen to like Indian food. Did I choose that? Well, in one way, so what? I don't care. I desire Indian food, and so I'm going to look for an Indian restaurant. Now, do I want to be able to change my desires? Well, sometimes, but in sometimes not, right? Do I want to choose to make vomit taste delicious? No. And that evolved probably not to be volitionally changeable for a very good reason, because if we chose then to find vomit delicious, we might eat it and then die. But even if a first order desire like hunger arises non-volitionally, that doesn't even mean that there's no volition. First of all, there's deliberation, given that I'm hungry, what restaurant I'll look for. But there's also second order desires, the desires that we have about desires, and you touched upon that. So for example, I might love the taste of, and I might love the smell of grilled meat, but for other reasons, say I decide that I don't want to cause harm to other conscious beings. I decide, okay, I'm going to try to be a vegetarian. And through practices, I might, by practicing being a vegetarian, despite my desire to eat meat, I might eventually find meat disgusting. And people say that you can actually change your desire structure in this sort of way. And again, you might say, well, where did that second order desire come from? And I would grant, sure, culture has a role. The PETA movement played a role. I read some book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. It convinced me.
Michael Pollan.
Michael Pollan's book, and
But-
sure,
but
all those
Peter-
things influenced me. But I might say, well, so what? I was influenced by these other things. That doesn't mean that I don't want to choose based upon the desires, first order or second order desires that I now have.
So I don't think we have much of a disagreement. But what I think, it might be slightly semantic or definitional. I would just say all of what you said is accurate. Let's not call that free will. And the fact that we're separating, even you are attributing this kind of agency to animals. So we go lower on the phylogenetic scale, we attribute it to white-footed
Or higher.
mouse,
Yeah,
right? And up the scale to humans. I would say that's great. Let's call that degrees of autonomy. Let's call that degrees of agency. We could even start specifying different types of rational control. This kind of, I approve of my desire for India versus the unapproving addict who has a first order desire for drugs, but a second order desire to stop wanting the drugs. That's a different agent than one who approves of their first order. I acknowledge all that. I think there's a different set of language we should adopt.
But Gregg, earlier you mentioned semantics. Why does it matter? To Shadi's point,
It matters
that
for
if
the
we
reasons-
believe it,
yeah.
we can bring it into existence. Why does it matter?
It matters for exactly the reasons that Shadi is pointing out. It matters because it has implications for public policy. It has implications for criminal law. It has implications for morality. It has implications for our interpersonal relationships. And that's where I think the separation, let's separate, fine. Let's adopt a different set of languages for those kinds of control conditions that agents have that is neutral to the free will debate. Call them degrees of autonomy, agency, volition, rational control. And then the free will debate, in my mind, again, I'm defining free will in the clearest way possible. It's the control and action that licenses these types of reactions, judgments, and treatments, right? To separate it is to try to walk on ice. It's to try to remove the practical importance of the debate about agency. And so the question is whether or not these differences in white-footed mice and humans, whether they license differences in treatment. That's the kind of key philosophical point. I think that's where we agree. Shadi and I agree.
So I wanted to say something about the degrees of freedom. Like that's exactly what I was thinking when Peter was talking was, we're talking about degrees of freedom. So certain people have many more degrees of freedom. Others are more limited. Say you're a drug addict. They have less control in the sense of their ability to override these basic impulses. They have less second order, sort of top down, we would say, ways to, you have a sort of unconscious desire that bubbles up. Sometimes it's really strong and powerful and it overrides your ability to have some sort of higher moral understanding that can like suppress that desire. But it's still one part of your brain, prefrontal cortex, suppressing another part of your brain. And so I think it's all tied in the brain, but we have different degrees of freedom. But when it comes to what that means in terms of society, like you're talking about these addicts, I agree with you. Like, I think that doesn't mean, there should be, everyone can just kind of be out there and do what they want. I think that when you have to look at society as a whole, if somebody is a danger to society, it's not even a moral judgment about them on a personal level. It's this person is a threat to others and therefore they need to be removed from society at some level. Whether then they get punished for that, it's retribution or not, that's when the question of morality comes in. Right. But I think, but
if free will isn't real, then is it really punishment or is it revenge? Is punishment the appropriate response?
I think the punishments are so other people won't go ahead and do that. So if they know, look, if I see that person who committed a murder is going to get this punishment, it's going to stop me from wanting to do that same behavior. So it's a way to kind of
Well, you don't need free will for that kind.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't.
You do need free will for retributive punishment.
But what if you have, let's say, a person who commits murder and they're then incapacitated, that let's say the police shot back and then they became paralyzed. So they're never going to be able to commit another murder. There is no threat to the broader society. I think your argument leads us to believe that that person should not go to jail because they can't commit any more crimes, where I would say that even if they're incapacitated, even if they can't commit another murder, justice requires that someone who commits a murder is punished for it.
But that just so that other people see that something...
No, he wants retribution.
You want retribution.
He wants retribution.
So that person is punished.
Well, let me put this, what would you say, Greg?
Yeah.
A murderer who can no longer commit murder, do you think that person should go free?
So I think there's a number, and this is where your intuitions may win out in terms of general public. So I have a example which I think is the biggest counterexample.
Can you start this answer with a yes or no, though?
Short answer, no, but it depends because there might be other sanctions, other processes. So I call it the 90-year-old Nazi example, right? So let's say there was a person who committed atrocities and war crimes during World War II, flee to South America. We hunt them down. They're in their 90s now, and we capture them. They've been a model citizen for 50 years. After the war, they've committed no crimes. They've been like a regular member of the community and the society. And the question is like, what kind of punishment does that individual deserve? Yes, I'll bite the bullet. On my theory, on a kind of incapacitation account, we have enough of a track record. We also know recidivism rates basically drop down to zero after a certain age. So that's just true empirically. Most crime occurs between 20s and 19s to 20s, and then drops precipitously, and then eventually almost down to zero. That's not to say, though, we shouldn't do anything. So we might be able to have a trial, and the purpose of the trial would be some form of restorative justice. It could be like a South Africa, finding a fact kind of thing. So South Africa had to make a choice, and this happens a lot in what's called transitional justice scenarios, where the atrocities of apartheid had to be dealt with. One way to deal with it is to hold everybody accountable, engage in kind of retributive punishment, try to determine what individuals did, and then hold them accountable. They decided that would not be beneficial for them moving forward, and they engaged in an alternative process. And so what I think is there are grounds for restorative justice. So if there are any victims left of this 90-year-old Nazi or just descendants of individuals who suffered from the Holocaust, there might be a need for a process of finding a fact. So I said earlier, you could be causally responsible. Let's determine that this 90-year-old individual was causally responsible for certain atrocities. We determine those facts in a court of law. Then we could also engage in a forward-looking practice of restorative justice with victims or descendants of victims. In fact, actually, studies show that victims want these types of processes more than they tend to want retributivism. People don't believe that, but actually, victim studies, there's great
So
study.
let's do a study right here.
Yeah.
Shadi, would that make you happy?
No, he's not going to be happy.
No.
Yeah.
And, there are victims. I mean, there are victims who want retribution, and just tell them that this Nazi or this terrible, evil person committed these crimes, but they'll spend their whole life not even spending a day in prison. That to me is an unjust world. That's not a world I want to live in.
But there are victims who also want to see a perpetrator's arm cut off. And we would argue that even if you're a retributivist, certain punishments are going to be deemed disproportionate, right? So there's going to be certain things where you say victims might want X is unjustified. So my question then is retributive punishment in general justified?
Well, there's nothing worse than death as a punishment, and that's certainly something. We have a death penalty. It shouldn't be used a lot. It should be used in very specific instances.
Or never.
Well, I mean, I think for someone who's at Nazi level of evil, I think there's a strong argument for the death penalty.
And first of all, I think to detract others from doing this, but also I think we can act as if we live in a society that people have free will, even if, academically there's no evidence to suggest that it exists. I think that it is to have a functioning society, it's important for us to act as if there is free will, which would mean to punish these people. And,
the question is, what's the justification? And so
I
you
think we
vacillate
evolved
between compatibilist and a skeptic kind of view of
because
what
I
the
think,
justification is.
I think we evolve free will for a reason, that it helps us survive not only as individuals, but as a society. And so it's an important construct that, and I it's very hard to design experiments to show, what would it look like without free will if we really didn't have this perception, because we're all living under this perception, right? But I do believe that it evolved for a reason, and therefore it's important for us to function as a society. So now when we know academically there is no free will, and then we start saying now we want to impart that on society because we have this knowledge now and shift everything, I think there's going to be problems there.
So
Heather, Gregg, Shadi, and Peter, I want to pause you just for a moment because I want to throw a verbal grenade into this conversation, if you will. We are having a roundtable in person, but our audience is joining us via YouTube, via their podcast players. So for people at home, did you choose to click on this and watch this, or did YouTube choose it for you? I want to talk about the role of algorithms. I want to talk about the role of AI in whether or not we believe that free will is actually a thing or if it's an illusion. To what extent are algorithms shaping our behavior? Peter.
Well, I've been trying to make a distinction between discussions of free will, whether we can have some effect on the future outcomes that we choose, versus questions of morality. But I think I'm largely failing because everybody wants to talk about morality. So if we talk about morality, including whether we choose to click on a YouTube video or not, I'd say we should also make a distinction between moral responsibility versus what we do about it, what we should do. Like, should we follow a Swedish model and, have restorative justice, or a Texas model and have a retributive model? And these are all separate questions. I would ask, including the question of why we do something like click on a link, where does the moral responsibility for that come from? And I would argue this is where we have to really talk about how we end up at this moment making the choice that we do, right? Is it simply due to the way the atoms are hitting each other at this moment, or does it have something to do with our own deep actions in the past? So let me just give a concrete example. Say I live somewhere, I don't know, in some steppe in Mongolia or something, and it's midwinter. It's minus 40 Fahrenheit or Celsius outside, and I've run out of wood. Well, my children are literally freezing to death. at this point, there's no wood around. There's nothing I can do about it. So in what sense am I morally responsible? I didn't choose there to be no wood right now. I would say, nonetheless, you're morally responsible because way back in the summer, when you had the capacity to imagine possible scenarios, you could have played this out and realized you needed more wood. And so the moral responsibility, separate from the question of what you do about it, is very much tied up with our capacities to imagine. And this capacity to imagine, and this is why I think free imagination is as important as free will, or it's even more important than the question of volition, is how we play things out, separates us from animals, right? So no tiger thinks to itself, well, next year, or say, so no tiger in Sumatra is saying to itself, well, next year I want to be a different kind of tiger, that eats fewer tapirs and more pangolins, right? They can't think that. They're driven by desires that are instinctual. We, however, have this unusual capacity, a sort of meta free will or second order free will, where we can choose to become a new kind of chooser and say, next year I want to be a person who can speak Mandarin, and you can set about doing that. Or next year, this coming winter, I want to be the kind of father who won't let his children freeze, and therefore I'm going to do a lot of preparation now. And this capacity to imagine is really where moral responsibility comes from, not action. Action follows from what we play out in our minds.
And I think this ability to imagine alternatives is really key when we think about algorithms and how they affect us, because I've been struggling more with some of this where in my meditation practice, I just have sometimes this very strong urge to check my phone, and I almost feel in a way that I almost don't have control over. My hand is almost, it has its own will, let's say. But then I can then think, well, okay, how do I prevent this from happening in the future? So, what I can do is, well, what I have done, I've bought a phone lockbox that cannot be overridden. And you can put your phone in there. There's a timer, and I guess you'd get a hammer and try to break it, but that's then be a little bit too difficult to do. So those are things that are within our control. So even when we think we're prisoners to the algorithm, we're prisoners to our phones, there are options that are available to us. They do require creativity. They do require a lot of willpower, but we do know that it's possible to overcome these urges because people do it.
Well, also, I would say it requires a strong community to help keep us well scaffolded and guided. So, for example, cultures again and again create systems like a Sabbath. On this day, you can't even turn on a light, or you can't use your cell phone. And well, if you can't, if the community enforces that, if that's part of the culture, that guides you away from your, first order desires to check your phone.
But I would just say that we have, as humans, as compared to other animals, we have the greatest capacity to have self-control because we can think into the future. We have the, proportionally largest percentage of prefrontal cortex compared to the rest of the brain than other animals. So we have the greatest capacity for self-control, for thinking about our future and making these decisions. But I would still say that all of that is a byproduct of our brain. It doesn't insert free will into the equation. It just says we have a greater capacity to have self-control, to think about the future, to make decisions based on imagined futures, still products of the brain, not something outside of that.
Yeah,
and which is
with
your
you,
constraint.
That our actions are the result of brain processes, one of which is the neural realization of our conscious experience.
But you're saying then consciousness impacts.
Absolutely. So, for example, consciousness is very much related to, the consciousness is realized in neural activity, but it's not simply a downstream consequence of unconscious activity. It plays a causal role in what will happen subsequently. So, for example, consciousness, I think, very much evolved so that animals have a kind of world hallucination of what's really the case. Central to that is the capacity to choose what to attend to next. So, even if I have locked-in syndrome and can't act in any way, I can choose to pay attention to the radio or the television and so forth.
But can AI then, because we're talking about AI, can AI, I'm asking a question now, but I've been thinking a lot about AI and how, I think it's going to be much more intelligent than we, has access to greater amounts of information, can do greater, processing speeds but that the last thing left for humans is consciousness, right? But my question is, could AI ever have free will, and what would that look like? What would that mean?
Or could it augment our free will if you already allow that we have it?
I mean, I think it controls us.
Let's give this one to you then, Gregg.
Yeah. Well, on the algorithms and the AI, I would say it's not going to cut either way in terms of like whether it helps determine if we have free will or not. What I would say is that it could add needlepoint to intuitions we already have. So we already are worried about, let's say, our actions being causally determined by factors outside our control. Algorithms, in some cases, and you mentioned a few, are cases where sometimes the algorithm could figure out our desires before we could figure out our desires. And when those kind of things happen, people do feel a little disturbed. But the truth of it is, those desires in all cases are outside the control of the agent. So there's a classic example where apparently an algorithm figured out that this person was homosexual before they figured out they were homosexual. And there are ways you could do this. You could, the algorithms could determine what images you linger on, what content you gravitate towards, what books and music you're listening to, and it builds a profile of an individual. And yes, AI will at some point probably be as good as spouses, or maybe better, in knowing who I am. In some cases, better than the individual knows who they are. I'm not sure that's going to prove to anyone we lack free will. That's probably not going to cut either way in any of the debates. But what it does show is that even in the normal cases, right, our brains are wide open to be hacked. And one of the things we worry a lot about, I think, is the privacy issue with algorithms creating an individual's desires, manipulating them in various ways to purchase various products. Right. And I think when you do think about agency and free will, and you have a proper understanding of the causal sequence of what leads to action and how beliefs and desires are open to manipulation and influence, we have to, yes, protect ourselves against industry who are going to want to have access to that information so that they can manipulate your thoughts. My daughter's 16. They know what appeals to a 16-year-old girl. Yeah. Right? And they could push in their various forms of content control, creating in her desires for products, beliefs that she needs these products. That's a very troubling thing as a parent. But society for, centuries have been influencing people's behavior in the same way. It's just exposing it in a way that's maybe more problematic for people. Advertisers have been trying to manipulate beliefs for centuries, right? We're just now more effectively able to control and maybe manipulate agents. And there's certain things you could do to protect yourself, but then there's a whole lot that we can't, because what we now know from the behavioral cognitive and neuroscience is everything from the color of the wall to the positioning of an item on a table, to the color of the logo, is going to determine and influence choices.
But part of inoculating your mind against the danger of mind control, whether propaganda or
unconscious
advertising,
influences or music played in stores,
is to become aware of the hackability of your mind, and to realize, well, actually, what these people really want to do is control my desires. In fact, they want to control what I even imagine.
Yeah.
But this goes way back. I mean, all the way back to the beginning of religion. I think a lot of religions, particularly belief-based religions, rather than practice-based religions like yoga and meditation, belief-based religions like in the Abrahamic tradition, are very much about trying to govern your mind, right? Like if I want to enslave someone, I can control their body, or I can enslave their mind, right? So take a medieval peasant. They truly believed that, what the clergy said, if you don't actually give us, 10% of your grain or income, you're going to burn in hell. If you question the power structure, the power of the clergy or the power of the aristocrats, you're going to burn in hell. And peasants believed that, and therefore they were controlled. So I think it's very central to actually free will is to free your own imagination from those who are trying to control your
There are
imagination.
things, and Heather touched on this earlier. So there's a classic example in 1970s. They had 4 pairs of pantyhose laid out in a consumer department store kind of scenario. And they asked women, which would you purchase and why? And overwhelmingly, they chose D. And they gave them explanations. I don't know what kind of explanations for good pantyhose, but durability, elasticity, comfort. The trick is that they're all identical, and they mix them up to make sure there's no manufacturing differences. And this is simply what's called a positioning effect. People have an unconscious bias to prefer things in the rightmost position. And it's been replicated in numerous kind of scenarios.
Is that all people, or is that people who happen to read perhaps
it's
from left
great.
to right? Or
it could
right
be
to left?
societally contingent, right? So if you're left-handed, it might have an effect if you read in the opposite direction. So I don't know if it's been done in non-weird or non-Western cultures, right? But you would have the same effect. It'd just be a different positioning effect.
But we have to make a
Hold on,
distinction.
let me just say, so
okay.
one of the things that exposes is that people confabulate the reasons why they make the choice. So I choose D, and now I have to explain to myself why I chose D. What's not transparent to me is that I'm choosing D simply because of positioning. And so what I do is I confabulate, which is a fancy word for making up the reason.
But are you
It's a
taking
post
away?
hoc-
Are you taking away their agency by saying that that's what's happening here?
Well, no, it's just it has to be what's happening here, because the reasons they give can't be the reasons, since there's no differences
Because
in
they're made up,
elasticity,
right?
right? There's
Well,
no
this is the key
properties
difference.
that-
There's no differences, right? I think we have to make a distinction between picking and choosing, right? So if there's 10 apples on a branch, they all look the same. I just kind of pick one, and I can be influenced by various things that I'm not really aware of. But I would say choosing really focuses not on just picking among things that are equivalent. It's really a matter of deliberating over fundamental differences. Like most choices,
But you may
think
not know the
But
differences.
most choices in life, in a way, are not very consequential. Like if I eat salmon tonight or pizza, I won't even remember in a month. But there's 4 or 5 decisions that are highly consequential for our lives. What country we live in, whether we get married and to whom, where we go to college, and whether we have children. And now these are very consequential, and we don't simply pick.
Wait, can I
I
push
don't say,
back
well,
on that?
Tom and Bob are equivalent. I'll just choose Bob for no reason. I would say, no, people agonize over this because and why? Because they're so consequential. Like, Tom might speak my mother language and be more intelligent, but Bob is kinder, and I can actually.
Well, what they're not aware of is the reasons why they're making that choice. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
I want to push back on this. So, okay, as I started, my interest in my research was in studying the neural basis of consciousness. Then I got very interested in the neural basis of these unconscious processes, because what I discovered is most of our decisions and our behaviors are being dictated by things that are happening outside of awareness. And all of these priming studies, which are basically like, if I gave you a bunch of word pairs to read and then I say, name any detergent, you're more likely to say Tide if I showed you the word pair ocean moon, and you'll come up with all a post hoc explanation about why you did it, might not know the real reason. So we know from a whole variety of studies that all these unconscious influences are affecting what you feel like. You're attributing a lot of agency, but a lot of it's being impacted by these things behind the scenes. But there's been studies that show, and I'll cite one well-known one, which looks at decision-making and something called deliberation without attention. So they gave people simple decisions, like, do you want to buy this oven mitt or that? And then they gave them a bunch of variables and they allowed them to consciously think about it. And consciousness has a limited capacity. So when it's a decision and there's only a certain number of factors, you can make a pretty good decision measured by post-decisional satisfaction by thinking about it consciously. Okay, I want to go stay within this price range. I want this particular color. However, when the decision becomes a bigger one, like, should I marry this person? Should I move to this place? Should I, take this job? When there's a whole variety of factors, it becomes overwhelming. Consciousness has a limited capacity, but the unconscious is virtually unlimited. And they found when they give people these many more variables and then they don't let them consciously think about it, they have to do with some other task that they're distracted by, but their unconscious is still mulling it over. Then they made better decisions. They had better post-decisional satisfaction. So if you think about, should I marry this person? You're not going to sit down and say, okay, these are all the pluses, these are all the minuses, let me add it up and see. You get what people call intuition or a gut feeling. And that's your unconscious has a greater capacity. It's less like specific, but it has greater capacity. And that's why I say when it's a big decision, take in all the variables and then don't think about it.
Yeah.
And then go take a walk, go take a shower, whatever. and then a decision will emerge and it'll just feel right. And so I push back on this idea that we have so much control and agency over especially big decisions that actually we should consciously take in the information and then let the unconscious, like, why do we feel the need to want to have so much control? I often say, like, I'll let my unconscious do it. It can come up with a better job. And just one last example, I remember I had this experience. I was coming down, we climbed a mountain, and I was coming down the mountain and I was taking each step deliberately or whatever. And it was taking me so much time. My friend was just sort of like, he's this German guy. He's running down the mountain and he's like, don't stop thinking about it. Just let go and let your body, trust your body. It knows what it's doing. And when I did that, I was able to go very much more seamlessly down the mountain. So consciousness is good for certain things, for being very specific and making choices. But other things, it's actually better to let go of control.
But sometimes your intuition is wrong and you shouldn't follow your gut.
Well, what does wrong mean? What does that even mean?
A divorce rate of almost 60%, I think, is evidence.
Well, maybe
people have
married,
wrong
but
intuition.
If you're asking, though, what does wrong mean? Does that mean you don't believe in good or bad decisions based on free will?
No, I do. But how do you measure what's a good or bad decision? And I think, like in this case, they measured post-decisional satisfaction.
Yeah.
How satisfied are you with that decision?
Yeah. You're leaving out even the best part, which is in those studies, when the people had time to deliberate in a longer form fashion, they were less satisfied with the purchase, because what happens is, like, I'm deliberating what car. I think they also did it with apartments, right?
Yes.
And they gave them 27 different things: price, location, and it was overwhelming, right? And the longer they had to deliberate, they were actually later less satisfied, because what people have is buyer's remorse. They remember the various reasons they were considering the other options, and then regret maybe not having pursued those other options. When they actually do it, like you said, cut them off before that period of rational deliberation, they actually have more subjective satisfaction. And that's how we're judging success. They're actually happy.
And
They're happy with the
we
choice
also
they
have a
made.
protective
They feel no
mechanism
regret.
that we to help us be optimistic is that we often, let's say you had a choice between going to Harvard or Yale. Harvard's obviously better, but if you have a choice of Harvard, Yale, and you choose Yale, once you make that decision, you're going to then focus on all the positive things about Yale and all the negative things about Harvard to bolster your decision. I made the right decision. And, vice versa. So we have these cognitive biases, these post-decisional biases that we tend to start coming up with all the reasons why we actually made the right choice and like it more in the long run. To protect us from having buyer's remorse.
Okay, so to bring it back to computers, right? It would be a weird operating system that made decisions that were not subject to volitional. So I'm going to give you an example. If something popped up on my screen and said, you now have only one option, you must click this button. That's completely pointless. Everything that can be automatized should be thrown into the unconscious. However, when something appears on the operating system, it says, well, now you have to choose between this, and that's when consciousness is centrally involved. I mean, consciousness, I would say, is evolved really for the consideration of options, whether the imagination form of consciousness or the sort of perceptual form of consciousness, so that we can consider the options. And the options really arise when we're not sure what to do based upon automatic responses, very often because we haven't automatized them, because we've never confronted that before. So some weird example would be like, I'm driving down the highway, I've automatized everything. I'm kind of, this frees my consciousness to do deliberation about other things. But say some weird thing happens, like, a clown carrying a kangaroo starts skipping across the highway. Well, I've never confronted that. So now I've got to switch out of this fast parallel processing sort of zombie mode or unconscious mode where everything has been automatized to this other mode. It's like, oh, well, should I slow down? Should I honk? Should I open the window and scream at the guy? And we weigh them. And then, so it's slow, but you need both systems. You need a fast parallel system, and you need a slow sort of serial or deliberative system, and you need both. And so I think it's unwise to say, oh, well, the unconscious is causal of our actions, and surely it is. That doesn't imply that it's solely causal of our actions. And likewise, consciousness is causal of some of our actions. That doesn't mean it's solely responsible, right? Events are multiply caused, and consciousness plays its role in the domain of volition.
And I would agree. I agree with all of that. I don't think it cuts either way, because the control that the conscious would play in those other types of cases, again, is a question about, does that have the kind of control and action required for these, practices? I would also say that the conscious level is also hackable. So I'll use one example. We had one of the guys who helped come to our school, our business school, talk about and he regrets this, by the way. You know, when you're watching Netflix and you watch an episode and then the little thing says next episode will start in 30 seconds, 29, 28, counts down, right? This was a very intentional ploy to take advantage of our conscious cognitive biases. And what they found is prior to having the button, people might watch one episode and then consciously decide to go do something else. With the auto start, they could still consciously decide to get up and watch something else, but they are less likely to. And so it takes advantage of existing biases. And they found that binge watching becomes much more prevalent by just adding these little features. And so these are things called dark patterns that website designers employ all the time to trick us into making certain kinds of conscious decisions. So it's the same problem at another level.
Yeah.
Is the
No, but we
challenge.
can take control back, right? I think that what has
But then the desire to take control back.
well, right. So, for example, I mean, before 2007, 8, smartphones didn't exist. And now people spend 7, 8 hours a day looking at screens, especially on their smartphones. And it has had a huge effect on our society. And I think what we're witnessing now is a counter movement against that, because people have become so lonely, isolated, and full of pain, actually, because they have become disconnected through these devices, through social media, through getting your dopamine hit through likes, as opposed that there's an awareness that, okay, one action in my choices about shaping my life will actually not be about what I do, but what I don't do.
Sure.
And this is very important, I think, because in order for us to take our agency back from the advertisers, from the AI manipulators, we have to realize their game and realize actually they don't have our interest at heart. They want to sell their garbage to us, and we can make a choice. And we can say, okay, I'm going to put my cell phone. I might even get rid of social media. Like I was on Facebook. At first I thought it was amazing, right? I was like, oh my God, I'm meeting all these kids that I haven't seen since junior high school. And then, I realized, my God, it's actually not Facebook, it's fake book, because everybody's presenting themselves in a certain persona. Here I am on, a tortola with my shrimp cocktail. I'm so happy. In fact, they're miserable, right? And so when I was growing up, in the 1970s, you hung out in front of the 7-Eleven, you had your 10 friends, and the distinction between who you were as a person and your persona was very small, because as soon as you pretended to be something else, you get a punch in the face, or they say, who do you think you are, Whereas now the distinction, because of all this AI and, mind control, the different distinction between our personhood and our persona is huge. So lots of, especially young people now, but all people are focusing on their CV, their LinkedIn account. And this gulf between our personhood and our persona is so vast now that there's a huge amount of suffering, because you don't find a love between a persona and a persona. You find it between a person and a person. So I do think, getting back to AI, we have to rediscover our agency and take back our personhood and not be so focused on our persona.
Well, then,
often
Peter,
say
that brings up the concept you raised earlier. And so I want to get back to that, Heather, on whether or not AI could have free will. Like, where do you fall on that in the future?
I think, look, our brains are an algorithm. And, when we're talking about control, and you had asked this question earlier about your children and teaching them morality, and, I have children as well. I think what we can control is the input to our algorithm. And even with unconscious biases, right? These studies show like people are more likely to think, a Black person is going to commit a crime because maybe that's what they're seeing. And the input is always seeing that person of that color skin committing crimes. And then the brain uses heuristics because it's too complex to have to take each individual case. But if you change the input, the algorithm changes, and therefore you can change unconscious biases. So I think that Peter's on something with the choices that we can make about what we decide to enter into the system, or what we allow our kids to consume, which is going to impact their brain's algorithm and those unconscious desires and things. The question of AI. So I mean, my fear with AI, and I just came from a meeting where people were giving these talks about AI that was very scary, to be honest. I mean, they can cheat. They can now like lie and manipulate and for their own survival. And when they start to get sort of agency and they do things other than what we program them to do, and then they have access to all this information that we can possibly get in our whole lifetime, there's a threat there. But I don't think that they'll ever be conscious in their current form, which is another debate we can have, because they're just simulations, and like, if you simulate the weather, it's not going to actually be wet. If you simulate a black hole, you won't get sucked into your computer. So I don't think they can be conscious. And I think you need consciousness to have this illusion of free will or perception of free will. So without consciousness, they will not have free will, but they could very well have agency, which is deciding to do something other than what it was programmed to do.
The scariest thing about what you said, Heather, is in their current form. So it sounds like you're saying there could be a form.
It depends on the theory of consciousness you go by, but is it substrate independent? Could consciousness exist in something other than a biological brain? And if you believe yes, then it's sort of a functionalist. You think it's just, if I can build a neuron, a silicon chip that can do the same thing as a neuron, and then, so if you built like a neuromorphic computer, if you have, depending on your theory of consciousness, theoretically, it could be conscious. It could be a conscious machine, but then it would have to be something that can change and evolve, because we're not static. Our brain is always changing and evolving to the environment. So it would have to be some sort of matter you can build it in that can change. So it'd be very complex. But ultimately, if we can build something similar to the brain in a non-biological substance, theoretically, it could be conscious.
Well, this is where I think religion becomes very helpful for kind of ordering our priorities, because if you believe that God is the only ultimate creator and that he's the only one who is able to ensoul beings, give them a soul and give them, in effect, consciousness, then you can kind of rest assured that AI will never be able to get to that level, for the simple reason that man is not capable of doing what only God is capable of. So religion, even regardless of whether certain religious ideas are true or not, they help us order our universe and understand things that are otherwise very complicated. So if you're a religious person, you can mostly do away with this whole debate about free will, because at least in the Abrahamic traditions, God already gives you some sense of what you should believe. You follow that view of free will and agency, and you move on and do the next thing in your life, and you don't have to like freak out about what the science says.
And the free will was assigning yourself to that religion in the first place, or choosing to have that faith in the first place.
Can I say something about religion? That we debated religious leaders at one time in Parliament. They in the UK, they brought together neuroscientists with like the heads of these major religions, and we had this debate about, if we discovered the neural basis of consciousness, what would that mean for the concept of a soul? And the consensus was, at least from the religious side, which I think is true, is that it's independent of what the science finds, right? That this soul, this concept of or maybe there's just a consciousness out there, maybe you call that God or however you conceptualize it, will exist independent of whether we find a neural basis of consciousness or not. The soul is a separate thing. And that kind of gives me that, as when I take my scientist hat off, gives me some comfort to say, yeah, maybe there is something special about this humanness and this feeling that I feel in this consciousness. But I recognize that as being a belief that doesn't necessarily have any proof, as a scientist.
I'm talking to scientists here, so you'll have to forgive me.
I'm a philosopher.
Okay, I'm a philosopher too. What is this obsession with proof?
Because I think I could believe, there's this classic idea, like maybe there's how many religions in the world, right? So it's like, you might believe in one, I believe in another. How do I know what is the right even religion, let's say?
Well, that's why it's faith.
Right. But so I guess I'm a person who finds myself in the world. It's absurd that we're here at all, right? You think about the universe, the vastness.
Here as in, though, we exist.
We exist, that we're conscious. This little piece of matter that happened to organize itself in such a way that gives us the concept of understanding the universe. Like, when you think of the enormity of the universe, it's ridiculous, right? So even that gives me a sense of awe, of like, wow, there might be something. Of course, there's something beyond what my little brain could even fathom. But I am curious about, what is the real explanation? Is there a real explanation? And so you can tell me your belief, and Deepak Chopra can tell me his belief, and we have all these different belief systems. So for me, the scientific method is the best way to try to get to what is there a real truth? And then I want to know what that is. And if it is a God, what kind of God is it? And which scripture should I be following?
But you can't use the scientific method for choosing a religion. That seems like an odd way of going about it.
Is there a real? Okay, it's forget the religion part. Forget even that. Okay, like maybe a lot of them are man-made or whatever. Is there a true reality, a creator of the universe, a creator of humanity out there? And if so, how do I get to an understanding of that knowledge? Is there a truth?
Is that a hypothetical question, or are you asking the man who has faith?
I'm not. I mean, you'll have a belief in that, and somebody else might have a different belief. And I want to know, is there a way to get to an understanding of what really the answer is.
But I think the whole idea of believing in God is that you can't prove it through science. It's unprovable in that sense, and that's why it has to be taken on some level of faith. I mean, God, if he wanted to, could have appeared and said, "I'm God, and there's no doubt that I'm here because you can see me." But
Supposedly he talked to Moses, I think, and told him
yeah,
that.
but he only showed himself. He only shows himself to prophets in that sense, and then we have to kind of take the prophet's word on it.
Right.
If he wanted to make it unmistakably clear, he could have just constantly shown himself to us. But then that would take out the agency and free will, because if God is so obvious that everyone can believe in him, then there's no challenge, there's no test, there's no moral wrestling. God wants to put a question to us and say, "Here's a challenge. Now it's up to you." Like, it shouldn't be so easy and so straightforward.
What's his name from C.S. Lewis? You know, and he conversion to Christianity, and he had this like sort of epiphany. Some people have these sort of revelations, or there's something that strikes them that creates.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a different question, but there's places in the brain that you can stimulate that give you religious experiences, that, or people get temporal lobe epilepsy and suddenly they become hyper religious. Like there's certain, neural bases to religious belief, but there are certain people that have these experiences, or maybe they do psychedelics and they have an experience, and then suddenly it shifts their belief system. I still don't know. It's like, let's say somebody does a psychedelic and they say, "I talk to God, I talk to the spirits." Am I supposed to believe that to be true, or just their subjective experience? And so I think, yeah, you're right. It's a personal choice or belief that maybe there is no proof to it. That's why I said I agreed with the religious leaders. Like, I don't think we can get to it with science. It's outside the realm of the scientific method that we have right now.
Gregg, you were raised in the Christian faith and you identify now as atheist. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you think that plays a role into where you fall on the spectrum of free
No,
will?
because there are free will skeptics that are theists, and there are free will skeptics. Like Dirk Pireboom is a Christian, and he's a free will skeptic. And there are people who are skeptical of free will for theological reasons, God's foreknowledge. There are Calvinists who don't believe in free will. So I think there's room for both views, even within a theological sort of framework. I would like to go back to the AI question, though, because I want to pose this in a different direction as a kind of maybe challenge to the rest of the panelists. Maybe there's a kind of consensus that there won't be free will, right, for AI. But we might have to confront other challenges. Like, we might have certain types of agency. We might end up with AI having a certain kind of autonomy, right? They're independent of their design. They bootstrap themselves. They learn. They're self-learning systems. In a lot of ways, they're like infants, right? They have beginning inputs, and then they learn from experience. They bootstrap their understanding. They gain more understanding. And so let's acknowledge they don't have free will, right? The question still exists, right? And there's a whole literature on this. It's called the responsibility gap literature, of what are we going to do when AI systems cause harm, right? So let's say an AI system shuts down a nuclear plant, or a self-driving car intentionally crashes, or some algorithm engages in some manipulative, harmful behavior, right? And we're already confronting this in reality. And what I want to suggest is we have to solve that problem regardless of whether we have free will, right? And so we are already coming up with possible solutions. Like, in one way, it's hard to say we should hold the coders responsible. That's like holding the parent responsible. And in fact, if the system is truly autonomous, the designer isn't dictating the behavior of the autonomous system. It's completely independent, right? But we have to also assess liability. Like, who is going to have to pay for damages if some, autonomous system causes harm or causes a crash or injures an individual? We want to resolve those problems independently of free will. So part of what I would argue is that we're in a very similar situation with humans, that we could acknowledge that humans have autonomy, that they're independent of their makers, they're independent of their parents, that they may even be able to deliberate and reason. They're going to definitely be capable of sophisticated behavior, driving cars and running autonomous machinery, right? But we also going to have to figure out what to do with the responsibility issues, right? And so that problem is an independent problem, and a problem I think could be solved without appealing to free will.
And I think we we do have to bring morality into this because we have to ask ourselves in a moral consequentialist sense, what kind of world do we want to bring about?
Yeah.
And we're confronting a situation where the technology is moving so fast that our moral intuitions and systems can't handle it. So, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, there's kind of 10 ways you could screw up. And so they said, God says don't sleep with his wife and don't steal his stuff, Now we have so much technology, right, that allows us to do things that simply don't fall within those 10 commandments, right? We can make glow-in-the-dark tomatoes. There's not going to be, commandment 8,000,000,005, don't make, glow-in-the-dark tomatoes. We're not going to say, oh, well, God said you cannot, cultivate embryos for their dopaminergic neurons for implantation into Parkinson's patients. Same with AI, right? We need to have a moral framework, I think, in place to know what kind of world we want to create or have happen in light of these new technologies, because the technologies are moving so fast. We have to catch up.
When you bring up the moral framework, I want to talk about pre-crime, this idea that comes from Hollywood, but could be very real when we're talking about AI and the potential for it to have free will. So if future tech could predict someone's probability, let's say, of committing a crime and whether or not they're likely to, and then we intervene, are we then taking away their free will?
Then we're playing God, basically. And God doesn't even intervene to stop people from committing crimes. So if we would do that as mere mortals, that would be a shocking thing. But also, we're talking about probability here. So let's say there's a 70% chance that someone will commit a crime. That still leaves a pretty big chunk, 30%, that they won't. And you can't really convict someone for a 70% crime. It doesn't really make much logical sense. So that's why I think pre-crime, if you look at it in literature and movies, it's always part of a dystopian future, a future that I think most of us would never want to live in.
I think also you can't, there's this element of unpredictability. So, and there are people who are doing this now. Like I was at Google at a meeting, they're trying to create algorithms, well, not Google, but people who were there, of predicting recidivism and, should this person go on parole or not, like to help judges make parole decisions. But human behavior, even though I think if, like I said earlier, if we knew everything about this person's history and their genetic code and every neuron in their brain and what they ate for breakfast and whatnot, we could potentially predict what they were going to do in the next moment. But when we're looking, there's so many variables. And even that is basically, we can't do that now. But let's just say we could, or AI could, then still looking into the future, there's so many intervening variables that you can't predict. Maybe this person was going to go murder someone, but then it rained that day and they hate the rain and then they didn't go out in or their car got in a car accident or whatever, and they didn't end up murdering the person. So because there's so much still unpredictability in terms of future, it's so difficult to predict human behavior accurately. Maybe, in the very, very short term, we can potentially do that. But when you go look into future, you really can't do it with the level of probability that would allow us to then pre-arrest somebody.
I've written a lot about this issue because it's a particular issue from my theory, right? But I agree actually with Shadi and Heather and others that I think we want to weigh, and I've written that kind of the moral considerations before, like with AI, we have to put in place now, is protections to weigh more heavily liberty of the individual. So to use an analogy to kind of build on what Heather was just saying, I use the example of a padlock that maybe has 20 dials. Of course, the true determinants of crime are going to be way more than 20, right? They're going to be hundreds, if not thousands. Even if 19 out of the 20 are in place, we have all these indicators, neurological biomarkers, statistical sampling, this lock still isn't going to open until all 20, right? And I say, given that the state is in an epistemically poor position, and that just means epistemic just means knowledge.
Thank you.
They're in a poor position in terms of their ability to know with certainty whether this is what outcome is going to happen. We have to protect liberty heavily in these types of cases. And so almost all real life cases, I don't think ever pre-detention, pre-incapacitation would be justified. But I am kind of curious what panelists think about this. There are hypotheticals, right? So I use this analogy in one of my books where I say, imagine I put a drug in your coffee. You didn't know I did this earlier. And it makes it 100% certain you're going to commit a crime murder within the next 24 hours. After those 24 hours, the drug wears off. And let's say you're not a violent person, but let's say the circumstances are such that it'd be impossible to follow you around and guarantee the safety of individuals. What should we do as a society? And I would argue two things. One, this is a problem for whether you are a believer in free will or not. It's also a problem whether you're a retributivist or not, because most retributivists are not pure retributivists. They're retributivist plus. They're retributivists for primary justifications for punishment, but they acknowledge there are other reasons to limit liberty, right? And so even people who believe in free will might say in a case like this, there might be need to hold the person for 24 hours to guarantee the safety of society. But the second thing, and I think this is kind of the philosophically relevant point of the example, is the justification for why we could license maybe holding you in this case and not in normal cases is the drug is circumventing reason's responsiveness. The drug is making it the case that you don't have the kind of agency that Peter was talking about earlier. It means that you can't modify your behavior in accordance with your values. You can't modify your behavior in accordance with your morality. You can't modify your behavior in accordance with your preferences and your personality. In a way, the drug is going to override all of those. And already in existing contexts, we do this. We have sadly, whatever your ethics of the view is, but we do allow for involuntary hospitalization of the mentally ill when we deem an individual as a threat to self or other. And we treat those cases different than normal agents because the agents aren't able or capable to modify their behavior in accordance with their reasons. They lack the kind of capacities that we've been talking about. So I would say I'm entitled to appeal to that same distinction that defenders of free will appeal to and say that this would be the reason why we could justify maybe incapacitating you for 24 hours and then releasing you. But in almost all real life cases, there's the padlock analogy, which would say, I'm never in a good position and we have to protect liberty. And in the cases of normal reasons responsive agents, basically agents who could modify their behavior in accordance with reasons, I would never have the justification to, because all I would have to do is provide you with good reasons not to engage in that behavior. Especially if we have good predictive technologies, that wouldn't be a justification for holding you. It'd be a justification for intervening. And if an agent is reasons responsive, you could give them reasons to try to sway them not to engage in the behavior that my algorithm predicts they're going to engage in. And I think in a society that respects agency, we have to give them the liberty to commit the criminal act before we imprison them. But this distinction is a really important one.
So, Gregg, in that appeal, I heard a little bit of agreement. I'm going to pause this, though, because this has been a fascinating conversation that we are out of time on. Peter, I know you wanted to respond to Gregg. I want to know if you can do it by also answering this final question that I'll have for all of you. And that's, this is an age-old debate, whether or not we have free will or if it's an illusion. Why does this conversation still matter?
It matters because we either have some say in what becomes of us or we don't. And if we want to live in a world in which our own agency has an effect on our own future, we have to have an understanding of how that might work, especially in the nervous system. You know, I guess I regard myself, we're actually quite similar in certain points of view. I would also regard myself, like Gregg, as a virtue ethicist. I'm very drawn to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the importance of the goal of cultivating character by making excellence not a decision, but a habit, by automatizing that. And I think that in one sense, getting back to the issue of pre-crime, we do that all the time with each other. Now, we're not interested in pre-crime judgments of a particular crime. What we do is we assess each other's character. Is this person competent, honest, reliable, trustworthy? And that is a kind of pre-crime assessment. And we also do that to ourselves. We say, what kind of character do I have? What kind of character do I want to cultivate? And it's a struggle to be a human. But we work hard and we say, I caught myself in a lie. I'm going to try to become better. We have a kind of pole star of the ideal human we're trying to attain. And, like going to the gym, if I envision myself looking like Arnold, okay, that's hopeless in my case, but you can eventually get to that if you work toward it, over a long time. I would say the same is true of our own character, that we have some free will in envisioning who we are or want to be, and then striving to make that a reality.
Shadi, why does this conversation matter?
It matters because it affects how we live. And if we think free will is real, at least that it's real to us, that will shape our actions in ways that I think are conducive to morality. I don't think we can separate the question of free will and the question of morality. One requires the other, both require each other. And I would like to live in a more moral world where people take morality as seriously as they possibly can. Now, I realize that, there's always doubts when you bring up the science of the matter. And I take that point, which is why I would say to listeners that even if the scientific method tells us something else, act as if free will is real, because it can be real to you for all intents and purposes, and trust your sensory perception that if you feel like you're making decisions, if you feel like you have agency, then effectively you do have that agency.
Gregg, same question.
Yeah, it matters because it's connected to almost everything that is human about us. It matters because it's related to what kinds of interpersonal relationships we have and what kinds of reactions are justified in those. It matters for public policy, and it matters a lot for criminal law. It matters also for things like social justice. Because when you view individuals as free and ultimately possessing individual responsibility, often we stop there. We don't inquire further as to what are the causes that are driving poverty, systemic inequality, educational inequity. And so I think the concept of just desserts is a pernicious one. I disagree with Shadi on the value of it. I actually think it's negative. It leads to excessively punitive practices. It often justifies economic inequality. We also use it in our justification of mass incarceration and the acceptance of social injustice. Because if individuals justly deserve their place in life, then they're individually responsible. They should have worked harder to get themselves out of poverty. And if they find themselves incarcerated, it's ultimately their fault and their fault alone. What I think is that once we abandon the belief in free will and the belief in just desserts, we could look more deeply into the causes that shape individuals, into the causes of economic inequality, of social injustice. And that will allow us to ultimately adopt both more effective but also more humane practices and policies.
Heather, final word. Why does this matter?
I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian view on this. I mean, I agree with a lot of the things that, my fellow debaters have said, but I also think that it matters to me because I want to get to truth and I want to know, does this thing called free will really exist? And I almost see that as an independent matter outside of what the societal implications are. Because I would argue that whether we get to a fundamental truth that it exists or it doesn't exist, and let's just say it doesn't exist, with all of our scientific methods, I still think that there's decisions that can be made about how we, treat criminals and all these things that we've been talking about. Whether or not actual free will exists, we can act as if it does, but I wouldn't go as far as Shadi goes with, we have to believe in all of our illusions and all of our perceptions, because that can get us into trouble too. When you just fully in this sort of subjectivity of things. I think there needs to be a healthy balance between our subjective perceptions and our illusions and objective reality. And then we try to make to our best of our ability rational decisions that's going to allow society to function in a way that we can all thrive and survive. But my fundamental interest in free will has to do with just wanting to understand reality as it is and understand truth, independent of how that actually will intersect with how it impacts us in a societal way.
Heather and Gregg, I recognize and want to appreciate that in both of your closing statements, you reignited debates with Shadi. Those will have to happen online for now. And I can't wait to see where this goes. I want to thank you all, though, for joining me here at this table. I heard the agreement, I heard the disagreement, and I learned things. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.